Подведем итоги сегодняшнего дня.
TV Rain, Дождь. The only Russia's independent network.
We are not allowed to work in our country anymore.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you.
It's a real war.
Maybe there are some negotiations about that.
There will be very serious consequences.
TV Rain Newsroom presents Russia Tomorrow.
Russia's border region tightens security after a week of external and internal violence, and Putin declares martial law in 4 annexed territories of Ukraine. The short and victorious war launched in February grows longer every day. We speak to you here from our broadcast facility in Europe, but our focus remains on Russia, and our mission has not changed. This is TV Rain. I'm Valeria Ratnikova. Let's get started. Russia's border region with Ukraine finds itself the center of global attention as external and internal violence increase. Mobilization in Moscow is cancelled, with local authorities saying in Russian capital's quota for reservists has been fulfilled. When Elon Musk tweets, hundreds of millions listen. Why is he helping Ukraine with free satellite internet and at the same time repeating Kremlin propaganda? The Belgorod region is 700 kilometers south of Moscow and shares a border to the west with Ukraine. It is a massive staging area for the Russian army, who use its roads, railways and airports to transport supplies and personnel across the border into the occupied territories and further to the front lines of the war. For Ukraine, Belgorod holds many key targets that fall within range of their weapons. In recent days, Belgorod has been in a state of high alert after local air defense artillery shot down alleged Ukrainian rockets above the city. Schools were cancelled and some residents were evacuated from areas close to military bases. On Wednesday, during a televised meeting of Russia's Security Council, Vladimir Putin declared martial law in the 4 occupied territories of Ukraine, referring to Ukraine's Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions just across the border from Belgorod. The Russian president accused Ukraine of terrorist methods, including sabotage groups that cross the border to attack Russian nuclear power stations and other targets. And on October 15th, Russian army officials reported that unidentified citizens from the Commonwealth of Independent States opened fire and killed 11 soldiers in a mass shooting on a rifle range near the village of Soloti, just 40 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. One of the likely victims was Vadim Godunov, a 39-year-old Russian volunteer from Smolensk, whose family said he had never served previously and never held a rifle. Relatives said Godunov signed a year contract to escape unemployment and provide for his life. But nobody in his family expected him to join the army because they all considered it extremely dangerous and none wanted to be any part of it. He did not tell anybody, just decided for himself, signed the contract and went. Eyewitness reports collected by local media, which are difficult to verify, say at least 2 Tajik citizens opened fire with automatic rifles at close range after a training officer insulted the men and their religion. Russian mass media soon published a list of soldiers they say were killed and named the shooters as 24-year-old Exon Aminzada and 23-year-old Mehrob Rakhmonov. Many more unverified eyewitness reports on social media say that at least 22 and perhaps as many as 32 men died in Soloti, including the 2 Tajik citizens. Nobody in Exon Aminzada's family knew that he was in the Russian army, but for 5 days this month there was no communication by the young man from Tajikistan in Moscow, where he was working in a restaurant to earn money for his wedding. Just like the approximately 4 million other Central Asian migrant workers who do manual labor for a tiny salary, Aminzada was in Russia because in his native country there was no work for him at home. On October 10th, Aminzadeh spoke with his brother by phone and said he was about to meet some friends near the metro station Lublino in Moscow. There was, according to Radio Ozodi, no mention of army service, no word about Russia's citizenship, and nothing unusual about their conversation. On the 16th of October, Aminzadeh's relatives learned for the first time that their son and brother was in the army, already dead and suspected of terrorism. How does a restaurant worker from Tajikistan end up in the Russian army and then die in less than 1 week before he even got to the front? Friends and family back home say Aminzadeh was not a religious man, and nobody believes allegations that he was radicalized by Islamic fundamentalism or some other outside force. Rather, they say it is entirely possible that Aminzadeh was detained on the street in Russia's capital city against his will and forced into signing a military contract because he is Tajik and Asian and not an ethnic Russian.
Это продолжение того же сюжета, например, что протесты в Дагестане, когда люди в национальных республиках, представители национальных меньшинств, они, ну, скажем так, вдвойне, втройне не понимают, собственно, почему они должны участвовать в этой войне. И люди из русских регионов тоже этого не понимают. И многие не являются жертвами пропаганды, они понимают, что это путинская война, кремлевская война, что это никакая не защита своей родины, что людей отправляют на захватническую войну. Но особенно болезненно и особенно ярко это воспринимают именно представители национальных республик, которые, в общем-то, тоже себя ощущают такими колониями Москвы. Да? Их, по сути, посылают на колониальную войну воевать за метрополию. Почему они должны этого делать, совершенно непонятно. И естественно, что они реагируют еще жестче. Тем более многие национальные республики, как мы знаем, номер один по количеству погибших в этой войне, там Бурятия, Дагестан и так далее. И для них эта ноша, она особенно тяжела, и для них это особенно большая трагедия участия в этой войне.
Such is the case with forced mobilization in Russia now. In order to fulfill a mandatory quota, draft officers are often able to complete their rosters by forcibly abducting into military service the same Central Asian laborers who work in restaurants in Moscow or pour concrete in Petersburg. Men are literally enslaved into duty without Russian citizenship, without training, without any thought other than this Tajik is a warm body and better for him to go into the meat grinder than a Slavic Russian boy.
Появились уже публикации в прокремлевских медиа о том, что есть, дескать, крымско-татарское подполье, которое взяло на себя ответственность якобы за этот теракт, но я думаю, что это все, скорее всего, фикция, скорее всего, выдумка спецслужб, и куда больше оснований предполагать, что это некая случайная ссора, случайный конфликт. С одной стороны, случайный, с другой стороны, закономерный, конечно, с учетом обстоятельств, с учетом характера войны, с учетом характера мобилизации, под которую гребут всех, кого ни попадя, не считаясь ни с какими правилами и не заморачиваясь ни за какие законы.
With her look at how Putin lost control over the Commonwealth of Independent States, we turn now to my colleague Ekaterina Katrikadze.
Russia tomorrow.
For as much as Vladimir Putin and his chief diplomat Sergei Lavrov have criticized a unipolar world and American dominance, there exists an unspoken sphere of influence. After all, the USA has long been setting agendas in the Western world, in parts of the Middle East, parts of Latin America, and in parts of Asia. In the post-Soviet world, however, the tone has largely been set by Moscow. If we look at the map of the former Soviet Union, certainly the Baltic nations broke away immediately and conclusively, but Belarus is completely under Russia's control, as is Armenia due to its difficult geopolitical situation. And though Azerbaijan has for years been swinging between Ankara and Moscow, it was always flexible to the needs of Putin. Moldova was changing its course from Putin's embrace to the West and back, with most of the population, if not half, in support of the socialists, a reflection of the Kremlin's deep and powerful political influence. In Georgia, things are much more complex, as the population there has categorically rejected the occupation of its own regions by Russian troops, although a completely dependent political class there provides Moscow room to move. And in Kazakhstan, it was unimaginable that Astana would ever step out of line. On behalf of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan and others, the main political request has always been for a strong partner, and Russia was naturally fitting this description. Emomali Rahmon has led Tajikistan since 1992 and in that time has never once criticized Putin's dictatorship, which is precisely why nobody would have ever imagined that Rahmon, the eternal Putin supporter, would risk a public demonstration of discontent, irritation and resentment. After all, there he was in 2021, the only foreign guest at Russia's May 9th military parade, saying all the right things to save Putin's face against Russia's growing isolation. He spoke at a summit last week in Astana in a break from his usual practice, but instead expressed his personal thoughts. What's important to stress here is that he did not break ties with Moscow because Dushanbe is in no way ready for that. Rather, he demanded more money and better conditions because he was bargaining, showing Putin that in these new current conditions, Tajikistan has a choice.
Да, мы малый народ. Нас не 100 миллионов, не 200 миллионов, но у нас есть история, культура, мы любим. Мы хотим, чтобы нас уважали.
As for the Central Asian republics, all of them were under Russia's thumb right up until the invasion of Ukraine. The constant economic difficulties of Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan all helped to create a strong dependence on Moscow. Their citizens came en masse to earn money, and in 2019 alone, before the pandemic, as many as 4 million labor migrants were sending remittances back home from Russia. These earnings might have amounted to mere kopecks, but for their families, this was enough to live on. And in Moscow, Petersburg and other big cities, these Asian guest workers weren't even considered as human beings. Their rights were violated in a brutal way. The migrants lived and worked in conditions of slavery, but their own governments could come up with no other viable solutions because there was no work at home to offer. For everyone, this humiliating situation was the least worst option.
Вот здесь сплю. Утром, как поставить смена, 8 или 9 до утра ночи. Эту комнату мы сами сняли. Они сейчас в данное время на работу, и кто-то своим делом личным.
Since the beginning of mobilization, governments which previously were considered as Russia's backyard have opened their borders to those Russian men who are fleeing the war. Unafraid of Putin's rage, these countries took an independent position that dared to disagree with Moscow. The choice to provide shelter to those for whom the locals might express a clear dislike is perhaps the greatest demonstration of foresight by both Kazakhstan's Tokayev and Kyrgyzstan's Zhaparov. Without making loud declarations against Putin's aggression in Ukraine, which is a level of freedom they don't yet possess, these leaders nevertheless are acting in line with European values, in line with the values of humanism.
Мы не признаем ни Тайвань, ни Косово, ни Южную Абхазию, ни Южную Осетию, ни Абхазию. И, по всей видимости, этот принцип будет применен и в отношении квазигосударственных территорий, коими, на наш взгляд, являются Луганск и Донецк.
Right now, it is literally all they can do, but doing it this way is a big start. In fact, the unity created in the ruins of the USSR that existed for years has only proven its ineffectiveness and inability at solving anything. This is particularly true in the case of war. It is enough to say about the Commonwealth of Independent States that among their chief priorities was, quote, to guarantee human rights and freedom, as well as cooperation for international peace and security. What is to become of the region after the conflict, if in fact the fighting does not lead to the self-destruction and the global war? In Washington, they are undoubtedly asking the same question, and quite naturally, it is not in Washington's interest to see Beijing rise up where the Kremlin has fallen down. But one main question hangs above all others. What will happen in Russia after Putin? The influential Washington Post is calling on the West to get ready. Of course, it would be tremendous to see Alexei Navalny in Russia's seat of power, fully prepared to institute democratic reforms, return citizens their rights and re-establish relations with progressive nations. But how much of that is likely to happen? What is to be done with a society that has hardened over the last 20 years, fooled into agreeing with the Kremlin's line that America is deceptively planning to seize Holy Rus? How can relations with Russia be rebuilt after Putin? Especially in light of the fact that the electorate may yet again choose to seat an unsympathetic authoritarian populist on the Kremlin throne, in light of the fact that he will not only return to repressions inside the country, but to the resurrection of control over former countries of the USSR. The Washington Post has no answers to these questions, but there is a recommendation. The West must remain open for Russians. And I would add to this myself, inform and show the world. Don't slam the door in anyone's face, but rather do the opposite and invite them in so that they may come to desire freedom for themselves and the neighboring countries of the post-Soviet space, so that they may no longer desire the resurrection of the empire.
Russia tomorrow.
After weeks of aggressive mobilization raids in Moscow metro stations, office buildings, hostels and apartments, this week, Mayor Sergei Sobyanin cancelled the military call-up for city residents, 10 days before Vladimir Putin's own promised deadline.
On the completion of partial mobilization in Moscow. According to the military commissar of Moscow, the steps of partial mobilization have been completed in full. Collection points for the mobilized will close on October 17, 2022 at 2 p.m. The summons sent to people's homes and workplaces during mobilization will cease to be valid. The successful completion of the goals of the partial mobilization was made possible primarily by the responsibility, dedication and patriotism of Moscow's residents.
Many are saying that Sobyanin was afraid of the negative PR that these raids had created in the Russian capital. Video images shared widely show silent officials standing in doorways and waiting to hand out paper summons, and even chasing after young men who tried to run away. Federation Council member Andrei Klishas, in a message on his Telegram channel, called for an investigation into the aggressive mobilization raids and called for investigators to legally evaluate the activities of officials who sanctioned such raids. Putin and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu previously said mobilization was only for reservists and men with combat experience, and set a quota of 300,000 military officials, promised the mobilized men would receive at least 2 weeks of training before being sent to the front. Putin's announcement sparked protests in dozens of cities, and tens of thousands of men have fled the country to avoid the draft. The raids also served to damage the reputation of Sobyanin, who up until recently had an image of a politician known primarily for improving the city of Moscow. But in many other regions of Russia, mobilization continues at full speed.
Russia tomorrow.
The prospect of Russia without Putin is a question that has been asked hypothetically for years. In fact, the Kremlin has actively sought to link the Russian president with everything positive that happens in the country, to effectively tie his identity and presence to the fate of the nation and its people. But now the same question is being posed quite seriously, and especially in the West, and about how the war has seriously damaged the political future of the man who has led Russia for the last 22 years. With more on what might come after Putin leaves the stage, we are now joined by former Putin speechwriter and political analyst Abbas Galyamov. Abbas, hello, and thank you for joining us here at Russia Tomorrow.
Hello.
My first question is about the last article of Washington Post, where it is telling its readers to prepare for the future where Putin is gone. What actually does it mean for Western circles? And I also want to ask you, up until now, if they ignored this possibility of future without Putin?
Look, the changes will be drastic. My personal opinion is that the new wave of democratization might start because the military victory of a democratic country, which was considered much weaker than the powerful autocracy which Russia was looked at before the war started, well, this thing will definitely inspire followers of democracy all over the world, including autocratic countries. And of course, all those who respected this, power and all this strong leadership, strong men like Putin, they will feel defeated. I think all the autocrats in the world will be on the defensive. So this is my personal attitude. I wrote about this the next day the war started. But, I never noticed, actually, I'm following the Western political discourse, but I never noticed them discussing this thing. I think what I saw, the Western leaders, they were discussing it, they were quite pragmatic. They were just discussing how to end the war and how to help Ukraine.
Can we see that Putin now is indispensable leader? Or we can say that he can be replaceable somehow?
Well, definitely he can. Now it's actually the best interest of the Russian political system, of the Russian elites, to replace Putin. Before the war started, for many years, their interests coincided completely. It was like basically the same thing. The interests of Putin, who was the main stabilizer of the system, were the interests of the Russian elites. The rules of the game were simple. Just belong to some clan, play according to the rules, which Putin said, and everything will be okay with you. Your personal future would be bright. At least you will enjoy high social status and high income. And so at that moment, people, elites, they didn't care about any alternatives. All they wanted is to preserve the system. With a few exceptions, in general, it was like this. But after the war started, Putin ended being the main stabilizer of the system. And now, in fact, he is the main destabilizer of the system. He cannot win the war, and he cannot lose it. He doesn't want to lose it because he will become completely illegitimate, and he will have to go. So all he wants now is to prolong the war as long as it can last, because every next day the war lasts, it's the next day for him to stay in Kremlin. But this ultimately brings, he has nothing to lose, so to say. But the system has something to lose. The system is afraid of the revolution and the total collapse of the system. So now, if they change Putin now, they can still try. They'll have to work hard. Maybe they will fail, but still there is a chance to preserve the system. If they choose a successor, and if the successor is good enough, reliable enough, so the majority of the system will survive. And this is the best interest of the system today. And who is hampering this? Putin. Putin is standing on the tracks of his successor. He is hampering the system. So definitely we can expect that when Putin becomes much weaker, he is getting weaker every day, as I'm telling, he cannot win the war. His army is retreating, it's losing, and the economics is dying, and the displeasure of the population growing. So all these things, they look like a revolution coming. So the best interest of the system to stop this thing immediately, because the system is no longer the system can no longer generate generate resources to continue on this track now. So before the resources are exhausted, they should change something in the system, namely end the war, start negotiations, and start normalizing the situation, and maybe get rid of the sanctions. And so if they change all these things, some resources might appear. So they need to have a try, and Putin is preventing this thing to happen. So at some point, I think they will understand. I mean, they already understand this, but so far they are still afraid of him. They know that he is ruthless. They're accustomed to him destroying his enemies, destroying traitors. So they are afraid to come up to him now to tell, well, dear Vladimir, if you don't have other plans, please, maybe let's think about a successor. So they are waiting for the moment to come when he becomes so weak that it becomes obvious even to him. When this thing, now this act coming to him with the suggestion, let us have a successor, let you step down. Now it will look like an encroachment on an attack on his authority, and they're afraid to make this. But when he becomes very weak and the revolution is on the verge of happening, well, at some point it will stop being, like a dirty trick against him. It will no longer look like an attack on his authority. It will look more like a solution to the problem, and he will perceive it like this. So most probably they're waiting for this thing to happen, and at a certain moment, this is exactly what is going to happen. I mean, I am not expecting a coup, an unfriendly action of the Russian elites against him. What I expect to happen first would be just suggestion to step down, to negotiate some successor, and for the successor to give all the guarantees possible to him, and then step down, and then start some kind of reforms. And only if he refuses to step down, if he tells, no, I'm not going to leave, I'm going to continue the war, and then I'm going to get re-elected in 2024. After this, we might start thinking about the coup. It will be the next step.
Okay, and who do you think can be this successor? Who can replace Vladimir Putin? And also, if we can imagine, is the Russian society really ready to go on without Vladimir Putin?
The Russian society is absolutely ready, and it's deep inside it wants it. Like 1/3 of the population, they want it not just deep inside, they want it like really strong. The other third of the population, they want it deep inside, they're still afraid to voice this. And the remaining third, they're afraid to go without him, but they understand that keeping him is a problem too. Basically, he has no followers who believe in him doing good for Russia and winning ultimately. Like, no, his base of support from this point of view, it disappeared. Even his followers, they are not so much happy with him. They're just afraid to object against him, and they're afraid that without him it will become even worse. They still don't believe in future with him. So the society is basically ready. And as for the successor, well, there are people around him who can cope with this job, I think. The main criteria, I think, is that it should be somebody, on the one hand, acceptable to this law enforcement and the military, on all this powerful, what we call siloviki, this, police, FSB, and things like this. And on the other hand, the person should be liberal enough as to start, untightening the screws, start beginning negotiations. I mean, the person cannot continue on the same tracks. Obviously, as I mentioned, the resources are exhausted. So, so it should be the person who will try to normalize the situation. I don't want to use the word liberalization, because liberalization, it presupposes some kind of ideology. This is an ideological thing. It should be somebody very practical, pragmatic, some technocrat like the mayor of Moscow, for example, or the current prime minister, who will be doing untightening the screws, trying to negotiate with Ukraine, trying to negotiate with the Western leaders, just because of pragmatic, attitude, understanding that something should change before the country collapses completely. So this is the basic demand against this, about this successor. He should be more liberal than Putin, but not very liberal as to destabilize the system. And because if he is very liberal, then all those law enforcement and the military will object, and there would be a deep split and a kind of civil war. Not like full-scale civil war like it was in Russia 100 years ago. But I mean, there might be a lot of violence, political violence.
Okay, and last thing I want to ask you, we know that Vladimir Putin declared this martial law for 4 occupied territories, which he annexed just last month. But frankly speaking, expectations were for a much bigger announcement, like, for example, I don't know, nationwide martial law, or closing of the borders, or full retreat from Kherson, or something with tactical nuclear weapons, or something like that. So what does this current decision tell us about the feeling of Putin now, the feeling of the war, and maybe about his future decisions?
My main feeling is that he lost ability to act decisively. He lost ability to change paradigms, to break trends, so to say. Previously he was famous for this. He was making strong decisions which were changing the rule of the games. Like he could start the war. Yes, it was peace, and all of a sudden the war started. So it was, trademark, Putin's vintage. But now he cannot stop war. He cannot win war. All he can do is just follow the path which is chosen actually not by him now already. I mean, now he is not so much leading as he is being led by the events. The events came out of his control. Initially, he started them. He set the trends, but they came out of his control, and now they're leading him, and he's unable to break away. So his decisions, they look weaker and weaker and weaker, which ultimately gives the elites the incentive to act. So I think if it continues like this, previously I thought that the successor project would not start before March. Before March, everybody would be waiting for what if Putin manages to put Europe on its knees with the help of this frost, severe winter. What they're promising, Europe will freeze, and without Russian gas and oil, so it will drop to its knees and crawl back to Putin, and he will start he'll make Ukraine. Ukraine will be left without European weapons, and after this, Ukraine will have to to come to negotiations table with him. But now it looks like even before this, the project might start, because his weakness, his inability to change something, will become obvious even before the end of winter. Especially, a lot depends on the situation. Everything depends on the situation on the battlefield, on the battlefield. If Ukraine continues pressing the way it's doing now, and it looks like this is exactly what they're doing, well, in this case, the project might start even before the end of this year.
Abbas, thank you for this image of the future, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you here at TV Rain.
Russia tomorrow.
The richest man in the world went on social media and suggested a peace plan that echoes everything the Kremlin wants and none of what Ukraine needs. It is a peace plan that angers many in Ukraine and the West and satisfies almost nobody. Why is Elon Musk, the CEO of an automobile manufacturer and founder of a rocket engine company, now diving into politics and international diplomacy? And why, of all places, on Twitter? One of America's top Russian experts say that Elon Musk is transmitting a message for Putin, and many who criticize the leader of Tesla, SpaceX and Starlink say his motivation is more about profit and less about peace. For more on Elon Musk's strange diplomatic overtures, we turn to my colleague Alina Ditkovskaya.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff.
It's 2019, the launch of one of the first Starlink satellites, a flagship project of the American Elon Musk. It promises high-speed internet in places where it is expensive or impossible to install fiber optics. 3 years later, Starlink has put Musk at odds with almost half the world. His Twitter feed is constantly in the spotlight, each new entry a fresh scandal.
What is Elon Musk's role right now in the war in Ukraine?
But what do you make of all of this happening for Elon Musk and because of Elon Musk, really, at once?
How are Elon Musk's satellites and the war in Ukraine connected? And why has media all over the world come to take such an interest in the behavior of the American businessman? Where did all these memes come from? Musk made to look like Shrelkov on the flag of Novoteslia, Elon Moscow, Musk presenting a brand new Tesla, Model Z.
Redo elections of annexed regions under UN supervision. Russia leaves if that's the will of the people. Crimea formerly part of Russia, as it has been since 1783, until Khrushchev's mistake. Water supply to Crimea assured. Ukraine remains neutral. This is highly likely to be the outcome in the end. Just a question of how many die before then. Also worth noting that a possible, albeit unlikely outcome from this conflict is nuclear war.
The reaction to Musk's peace plans was instant. The tweet received 38,000 replies in just an hour.
Can't wait to read your one-tweet solutions for Israel, Palestine, and Gondor, Mordor, please. Are you trying to legitimize pseudo-referendums that took place at gunpoint under conditions of persecution, mass executions, and torture? Bad path.
Next came former Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, Andriy Melnyuk, known for his emotional assessments of foreign politicians.
The only outcome is that now no Ukrainian will ever buy your f***ing Tesla crap. So good luck to you. F*** off is my very diplomatic reply to you.
Musk kept going and published a poll.
Let's try this then. The will of the people who live in the Donbass and Crimea should decide whether they're part of Russia or Ukraine.
And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky published the following poll in response. Which Musk do you prefer, the one who supports Ukraine or Russia? The Kremlin also responded to the Tesla and SpaceX founders' peace proposal.
Musk is still trying to find a way that peace can happen. But without meeting Russia's conditions, peace is completely impossible.
Despite the flood of negative reactions, the American businessman kept responding to the people he'd angered on Twitter.
Russia is doing partial mobilization. They go to full war mobilization if Crimea is at risk. The death on both sides will be devastating. Russia has 3 times the population of Ukraine, so victory for Ukraine is unlikely in total war. If you care about the people of Ukraine, seek peace.
Он впервые так активно действительно занимается политикой, в большей степени он отшучивался раньше, он доделал много шума, когда он говорил о покупке Твиттера, и сказав, что он обязательно вернет туда Дональда Трампа, ну, точнее, даст Дональду Трампу возможность вернуться в Твиттер, если тот пожелает этого. Вот тогда, наверное, это было первое такое яркое действительно политическое заявление Маска, но, тем не менее, оно казалось в рамках какой-то рекламной кампании себя и рекламной кампании покупки Твиттера, возможной покупки Твиттера. А здесь уже действительно это такие политические заявления.
У Маска в целом 100 миллионов подписчиков на Твиттере, и он кардинально отличается от того, какой он человек в реальности, от того, какой он человек на Твиттере. Вот этот выдающийся бизнесмен, гений и автомобилестроения, и космической индустрии на Твиттере выступает в роли такого тролля очень часто.
But that was only the beginning of the scandal. On October 7th, the Financial Times reported Ukrainian forces complain about Starlink interruptions, and this is a huge obstacle to Ukraine gaining back control of its territories.
В первой же неделе войны стало понятно, что Маск за свой счет, за счет компании Starlink, отправляет в Украину первые тарелки. Это, правда, штука, которую нельзя переоценить. Это очень большая, очень значимая штука была, потому что коммуникация в первые дни войны, мне кажется, это то, что позволило Украине устоять. Спутниковый интернет — это единственная инфраструктура, которую невозможно нарушить.
On October 11th, the political scientist Ian Bremmer drops a bomb. Musk told him personally that he's spoken to Vladimir Putin before publishing the tweet proposing a peace settlement. And apparently the president had told Musk that he was ready to negotiate with Kyiv on Moscow's terms.
На самом деле это вполне возможно противоречит американским законам, если действительно такой разговор был. Получается так, что некоторое частное лицо пытается выступить посредником между США и страной, с которой США находится в военном противостоянии. Это ситуация, которая может ввести его в, на самом деле, опасное легальное поле, что, конечно, если он это делает после того, как он разговаривал с Путиным, Путин, возможно, на него повлиял, то это уже существенно более серьезно, чем если просто он высказывает свое мнение. Но вот помимо Иэна Бремера это никто не подтвердил. Если это так, то это, в общем, наверняка, я уверен, что ЦРУ или ФБР занимается расследованием этого, был ли этот разговор или нет. И, возможно, мы когда-то об этом узнаем.
Dmitry Peskov, the press secretary of the Russian president, called Bremer's information a lie. Tesla's founder denies the claims as well. In Musk's words, he spoke to Putin only once, and that was about 18 months ago. The subject matter was space. But this did not prevent political scientists and one of the most respected experts in Russia, Fiona Hill, from calling Elon Musk Vladimir Putin's messenger.
Putin plays the egos of a big man, gives them a sense that they can play a role. But in reality, they're just direct transmitters of messages from Vladimir Putin.
Конечно, да, он может не договаривать, он, в общем, не связан никакими обязательствами говорить правду, только правду, ничего кроме правды. Он не политик, действительно, поэтому он все-таки человек бизнеса, и человек бизнеса, который заинтересован в прибыли и сверхприбыли.
The Starlink story is unfolding at the same time. On October 14th, CNN sources suggested that SpaceX refused to pay for a satellite network for Ukraine. Even before that, Musk himself complained on Twitter that his company had already spent $80 unreimbursed million and was in line to spend $100 million by the end of the year.
В рамках ленд-лиза огромное количество американских компаний сейчас зарабатывают много денег на войне. Многие тарелки Starlink были поставлены Маском без всяких дополнительных условий, особенно в самом начале войны. А по сути, Маск сейчас недополучает с каждой такой тарелки до $500 в месяц. Что это означает? Это означает, что он, безусловно, со своей стороны бесплатно спонсирует украинское правительство и украинскую армию. Большое ему спасибо за это, он действительно очень сильно помогает, но ему просто, мне кажется, по-человечески обидно, почему те, кто проходят через ленд-лиз, получают деньги, а он нет.
Musk himself claimed that he was simply echoing the recommendation of the former Ukrainian ambassador to Germany.
И манера, в которой это все было высказано, Маску, те протесты на инициативы, на мой взгляд, были чересчур жесткими и даже, может быть, недальновидными. В том смысле, что чисто на человеческом уровне никто не хочет, чтобы ему хамили за его собственные деньги.
But a day later, the richest man in the world changed his mind and said that Starlink would work for Ukraine for free.
Что лишний раз показывает, что доброе слово – это хорошо, а доброе слово и Пентагон – это гораздо лучше, чем просто доброе слово.
Не, ну с ним же поговорили, это очевидно.
Наверное, да, объяснили, что есть национальные интересы или общемировые интересы всех добрых людей. И зачем же становиться поперек ветра, можно же до Марса не долететь.
On October 17th, the reports appear that the Pentagon is, after all, considering paying for Starlink services. But Musk replies that he is no longer asking for money for the company. But he continues to talk about politics and even bring up the possibility of nuclear catastrophe on Twitter.
Так бывает, что богатые люди, очень успешные люди, в чем-то успешные люди, думают, что они могут быть, значит, экспертами во всем. Да? И я думаю, что это тоже как бы не надо как бы списывать со счетов.
Много лет в своей жизни Маск выступал как человек, который максимально похож на Тони Старка из киновселенной Марвел. То есть это такой максимально яркий предприниматель, которого заботит буквально весь мир. И когда он сейчас комментирует происходящее в Украине и что-то вокруг войны, рассматривайте это ровно так. Рассматривайте это как человек, который крайне озабочен тем, что у него есть немного там времени, лет 10, наверное, для того, чтобы успеть улететь на Марс, внезапно почувствовал, что, кажется, ядерная война действительно возможна, а это ставит крест на его возможности улететь на Марс как минимум здоровым. А Маск — это человек, который живет социальными сетями и буквально выплескивает туда все свои мысли.
Musk's millions of Twitter followers constantly speculate on what exactly goes on in his head. And most importantly, did that conversation with Putin really happen? It is a mystery. The last time Musk appeared in Russia was in 2021 at the New Knowledge Forum, although that was via video link. He was introduced by none other than Dmitry Peskov.
Я тебя попрошу об одном одолжении. Можешь очень кратко, буквально несколько минут, рассказать ребятам, как ты видишь наше будущее через 50 лет и что ты для этого делаешь?
This has been Russia Tomorrow. I'm Valeria Ratnikova. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, share with your friends, and support us on GoFundMe. The link is in the description. See you soon.